Hey guys, tonight we begin how ancient Mali kept their libraries dust-free and cozy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Uwe might be lying there, eyes closed, thinking about faraway empires filled with knights, palaces, or war-torn battlegrounds. But have you ever tried to fall asleep to the gentle, dusting routines of medieval librarians in the middle of the Sahara? Let us travel, not in a hurry, but as though walking barefoot across sun-warmed sand into the heart of the Malian Empire, sometime around the 14th century. A place called Timbuktu, nestled beside the Niger River, quietly held, within its earthen walls, one of the greatest manuscript collections in human history. Yes, Timbuktu in some sleepy minds is a myth, a joke, or a poetic reference to a place far away is real. It was dusty, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was brilliant. A city of readers in the desert, Timbuktu's golden era blossomed during the reign of Mansa Musa, often said to be the richest man who ever lived. Though wealth is what draws modern imaginations to his pilgrimage to Mecca, the truth is more quietly profound. Mansa Musa spent a significant portion of his fortune funding mosques, and more relevant to our sleepy tale libraries, there were no card catalogs, no buzzing fluorescent lights, no quiet please signs, because everyone already knew to whisper. In the libraries of Timbuktu, the knowledge was stored in handwritten manuscripts, often wrapped in leather and stacked in corners, boxes, or small wooden shelves. You might imagine these scrolls and books would be difficult to preserve in a desert, and you'd be absolutely right. But the people of Mali had solutions, quiet, methodical solutions, designed not for display, but for durability. Earthen walls and passive cooling step inside one of these ancient structures. The walls are made of banko, a type of mud brick that keeps the interior naturally cool even when the desert sun is blinding outside. The builders' artisans, trained through generations, knew the thickness of a wall wasn't just structural, it was atmospheric. Thick banko walls absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it at night, creating a natural temperature rhythm that mimicked the earth itself. The floors were often packed dirt or clay tiles, kept smooth with sweeping and regular moistening. Not with chemical cleaners, just water, poured slowly and spread with rags made from old fabric. This practice kept dust from rising, allowing scribes to write without particles landing on fresh ink. These libraries didn't have windows with glass panes. Instead, they had tiny ventilation holes, sometimes carved in decorative geometric patterns. These holes, placed at different heights and angles, encouraged airflow while minimizing sand intrusion, a naturally engineered dust reduction system. Dusting, binding, and the feather whisperers, the librarians of Timbuktu, to many of them scholars, scribes, and theologians, took their duties seriously. They used soft feathers or woven palm frond brushes to gently clean manuscripts. Every few days, particularly during the dry season, each book would be unwrapped, aired out, and dusted with incredible care. The leather covers were oiled lightly, with shea butter or animal fat, not only to keep them supple, but also to create a thin barrier against sand and insects. The manuscripts themselves were usually written on vellum or sheepskin, and later on locally produced paper. Some were imported, written in flowing Arabic calligraphy, while others included Ajomi African languages written using Arabic script. Each text was a treasure, not because it was rare, but because it represented hours, days, or even years of copying by hand. And so, they were treated like living things, rested, cleaned, and preserved. Even the method of stacking books had a science to it. Heavy volumes went on the bottom, smaller ones on top, wrapped in cotton cloths dyed with natural insect repellents like indigo or crushed neem leaves. Libraries as homes of quiet learning, contrary to modern libraries built for individual study. The spaces in Timbuktu often had communal benches, rugs, or mats. A teacher might read aloud from a manuscript while students copied along. There were no bells, no clocks, no strict hours, only the rhythm of learning, prayer, and meals. Food was sometimes shared on breaks: millet cakes, dried dates, or baobab. TS students reviewed the lessons of Ibn Sina or pored over legal commentaries passed down through centuries. This wasn't the ivory tower kind of academia. The libraries were extensions of everyday life scholarship, mixed with trade, family, and faith. Timbuktu scholars didn't retreat from society. They documented it slowly and carefully, in the same way they cleaned their scrolls. Pests and preservation. What about termites? Surely insects were a concern. Absolutely. But the Malian librarians had solutions. They used powdered clove, ground chili, and occasionally dried mint leaves, stored in small sachets placed near scrolls. These aromatic defenses created microenvironments. That discouraged ants and beetles. Some households kept geckos as informal pest control. These small lizards patrolled the corners, feasting on anything that moved and keeping the library ecosystem in balance. The buildings themselves were maintained annually. Every year after the first heavy rains, the community came together to replaster the mud walls. A communal act. Silent, rhythmic, essential, the same way you might replace a light bulb or change a smoke alarm battery. They repaired the very fabric of their learning spaces. Trade routes and ink stains. Now imagine the camel caravans. Thousands of them would pass through Timbuktu each year, carrying not just gold and salt, but ink, parchment, and books. Timbuktu was a port not on the sea, but on the edge of the desert, a knowledge port. Some manuscripts came from Al-Andalus, Spain, others from Cairo, Mecca, or Morocco. Each one was copied, summarized, annotated in the margins, and added to a collection. So many books, so many scrolls, so many tiny ink stains on fingers. Imagine going to bed with your hands covered in blue ink. The way we might come home today with blue screen lights still in our eyes. They wrote not for likes or views, but because they believed in Baraka blessing through knowledge. And so the sand settled. As the wind howled outside and the dust blew across the Sahel, inside these quiet structures, time passed differently. Books were not just read. They were lived with, dusted, protected, sung over, debated, cared for, like children or elders. And still, questions remain. How many of these manuscripts are still buried beneath the sand? How many lines of thought, scientific observations, or poetic verses still wait and read, unopened, hidden in forgotten crates? And what does it say about us, that such wisdom sat quietly under earthen roofs while the world hurried past? Would you like to continue to section 2 of story 1? He said. Continue, ChatGPT said. Story 1. How ancient Mali kept their libraries. Dust-free and cozy section 2. The Brotherhood of the Pen and the Secret Lives of Scribes Approx. 1,500 to 2,000 words. The desert sun has shifted slightly now, casting softer shadows over the earthen walls of Timbuktu. If you close your eyes, might still hear the soft sweep of a feather brush over parchment, or the faint crackle of drying ink in a warm corner of the library. But while Section 1 explored the structure and preservation of these sacred spaces, its next part will take you inside the quiet, patient world of the scribes. Those keepers of knowledge who never shouted, rarely left, and whose fingers were perpetually stained with ink. Let us wander into their world. The art of copying by candlelight. Imagine yourself seated beside a low wooden writing table in a library chamber dimly lit by an oil lamp. Outside, the stars begin to appear over the Sahel, but inside, your hand moves slowly, carefully, across a sheet of parchment. You are a scribe of Timbuktu, trained from youth to write neatly, legibly, and accurately. Your pen is not mass-produced, but carved from dried reed or feather, shaped by knife to a perfect point. Your ink is homemade, mixed from a blend of burnt gum, Arabic, charcoal, and water, sometimes tinged with natural dyes like indigo or ochre. There is no rush, no timer, no print quota. This is a sacred act, and it may take you 3 weeks just to copy a short treatise. Mistakes aren't just frowned upon, they're dangerous. In some traditions, a copying error in a religious text could alter its meaning completely. So, scribes trained their hands like musicians, steady, slow, and deliberate. Misplaced. Over a letter could turn Rama mercy into Rama wound. So you waited, you breathed, you worked only when your mind was clear, and you weren't alone. Women of the libraries, while history often overlooks them, the intellectual life of Timbuktu was not strictly male. Women were scholars, copyists, book collectors, and even owners of private libraries. One such woman, known through letters and family documents, was Fatima bint Ibrahim al-Fihri, often associated with early educational patronage and believed by some to be tied to the founding of educational institutions in Fez, but in Mali too, women like her played quiet yet powerful roles. They might not sit on the scholarly councils, but they were often responsible for maintaining manuscripts. At home, managing family libraries and ensuring that children, both boys and girls, learned to read and write. Some women even specialized in the decorative arts of illuminating manuscripts with floral borders or gilded titles. These weren't the bright gold leaves of medieval Europe, but subtle additions made with plant dyes, and powdered stones carefully rubbed into the page to avoid smudging. Their names are rarely remembered, but their work remains in the meticulous margins of texts and the quietly protected shelves of homes long buried in sand. The brotherhood of the pen among the scribes and scholars. There was a deep sense of fraternity. They referred to themselves as part of the brotherhood of the pen. Not a formal guild like in Europe, but a spiritual alignment, a shared belief that the pen was a tool of divine connection. In Islamic tradition, the thing God created was the pen. It was said to have written everything that would ever occur. In Timbuktu, this belief wasn't merely symbolic, it was practical. The act of writing, copying, commenting, or even cataloging was seen as an act of devotion. Many scribes developed their own distinct handwriting styles which were recognized and celebrated. Scholars might say, "This was copied by Ahmad ibn Musa, may God bless his hand," or "This line has the footnote of Sayyid Muhammad, letters flow like water." You might find a humble note in the margin, written in haste, as the rains began. Forgive the errors. Copied during the fasting month, my mind was clouded with hunger. This page smudged by tears during study of a painful hadith. In these margins, the scholars became human flawed, distracted, and heartfelt. Each manuscript was not just a text, but a snapshot of living memory, deeply connected to time, place, and weather. The hidden libraries of Timbuktu, the public libraries, were just part of the story. The real treasures were in homes. It is estimated that during Timbuktu's golden age, there were over 700,000 manuscripts, many hidden away in private family collections. These weren't secret in the dramatic sense. They were secret in the quiet, everyday waste stored in clay pots, wooden chests, and woven baskets tucked behind walls or under beds. Generations guarded them. It was common for a child to inherit not land or gold, but books. A father might write in his will, "To my son, I leave the Quranic commentary by al-Qurtubi, the genealogy of our tribe, and the poetry of al-Basiri bound in camel leather." These collections might contain treatises on astronomy, medicine, legal opinions, mathematics, and even music theory. And yes, there were even love poems, hidden between rulings on inheritance law. Some were written in Arabic, others in Songhai, Tamashek, or Fulani, but still using Arabic scriptablend known as Ajami. These weren't just scribbles. They were entire worldviews built by people who knew that even in the desert, knowledge could grow like a tree.
Oh, what did they read?
The libraries of Mali included works by Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Euclid, Ptolemy, and scholars from across the Islamic world. But Timbuktu also produced its own scholars, such as Ahmad Baba al-Timbuktu, a fiercely intelligent jurist and teacher who wrote dozens of books, many during his forced exile in Morocco. Mahmoud Kadi, compiler of the Tariq al-Fatash, a chronicle of West African history. Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, author of the Tariq al-Sudan, another essential text of Sahelian history. Their writings ranged from philosophy and ethics to meteorology and pharmacology. One manuscript, for instance, scribed in detail how to use local herbs to treat snake bites, listing dosages, side effects, and alternatives if the herbs were out of season. Others mapped the stars. Some discussed the correct timing of prayers. based on shadow measurements and astrolabe readings. A few debated maritime navigation, even though Timbuktu was 1,000 kilometers from the coast. Why? Because knowledge had no borders. Footprints in the dust, each of these libraries bore signs of use. It's not pristine, but lived in. A coffee stain on the corner of a legal ruling, paw print, perhaps from a wandering goat or a family cat pressed. Into the drying ink of a prayer book. A poem half finished, scribbled upside down on the back of a shipping manifest. And then there were the binder's notes. This scroll was repaired with blue thread, having suffered damage in the fire of 1431. And letters, send my greetings to Ali and Gao. I return the commentary and request a replacement copy. Mine has been eaten at the edges by mice. You see, this wasn't just scholarship. It was life. These libraries were places of routine, memory, family, weather, and time. They didn't stand apart from the world, they grew with it. And today fragments of them remain not in great citadels, of marble, but in boxes, basements, and backpacks. Smuggled out during times of conflict and kept safe by people who still believe the pen is sacred. As the candle flickers, the wind may still howl across the dunes of the Sahel, but somewhere, a book from Timbuktu sits unopened. A quiet rectangle of time, full of dried ink and the scent of leather, and you might wonder, if the libraries of Mali could survive the desert, the centuries, even the flames of modern conflict, what else have we lost, hidden under dust? By now, you've walked through the cooled, mud-walled libraries of Timbuktu. You've sat cross-legged beside a scribe, copied legal texts by oil lamp, and imagined manuscripts stacked carefully in wooden chests, dust-free, cherished, and humming with quiet life. But history does not stand still, even the most lovingly. Tended library eventually faces the unrelenting pressures of time, weather, and human violence. This final section follows what happened after. Timbuktu's golden age faded, and how ordinary citizens' quiet heroes risked everything to save the libraries of Mali centuries after they were first built. The slow fade of empire by the 1600s, Timbuktu had already begun to slip from global awareness. Once a bustling center of trade and scholarship, it now saw fewer caravans, fewer scholars, and less protection. The Moroccan invasion of 1591 disrupted the fragile stability of the region. Scholars like Ahmed Baba were exiled or arrested. Some libraries were looted, manuscripts destroyed, and others stolen and never returned. Still, even amid occupation, small family libraries quietly remained. Over the next few centuries, Timbuktu remained a city of reputation, but without recognition. Travelers from Europe arrived, often confused by how little remained of the supposed city of gold. But they missed the real treasure, hidden away in crumbling homes, back rooms, and prayer halls. Books were still there, but they were no longer central to daily life. Instead, they waited often unread for the day they'd either disappear into history or be brought back into the light. Modern threats, fire, flood, and fanaticism, the final and, perhaps most dramatic chapter of this quiet saga begins not in the 15th century, but in the early 21st. In 2012, a radical militant group associated with Al-Qaeda swept through northern Mali and captured Timbuktu. They declared war not just on governments, but on books, especially those they deemed heretical, un-Islamic, or too worldly. They began burning libraries. What they didn't know, at least not at first, was that the people of Timbuktu were already moving the manuscripts. The librarian's doorway entered Abdel Kaddour, a mild-mannered scholar and librarian from Timbuktu. Before the crisis, he had quietly spent years traveling by donkey and boat to collect endangered manuscripts from remote villages and bring them to safety. But now, with fire on the horizon, he would become something else entirely. Leadership, a quiet operation, began a smuggling campaign, not for drugs or weapons, but for books, using donkey carts, canoes, taxis, and wheelbarrows. The people of Timbuktu moved tens of thousands of manuscripts out of the city, sometimes one box at a time, hidden beneath blankets, sacks of grain, or loads of potatoes. They worked by night, whispering instructions to one another, often without phones, tracking numbers, or even proper maps. One librarian used his own front door as a sled, dragging it across the sand with manuscripts piled on top. This wasn't a government initiative. It wasn't funded by a foundation or backed by drones. It was a neighborhood effort. Triad teachers, old imams, teen boys, and shopkeepers all working to save pieces of paper no wider than a hand, filled with words written centuries ago. Why? Because they believed, as their ancestors did, that to lose a manuscript was to lose a memory. Hidden in trunks, saved by humidity eventually, these boxers' over 350,000 manuscripts were smuggled south. Stored in Bamako, the Malian capital. There, however, they faced another problem: the climate. Unlike dry Timbuktu, Bamako is humid. Parchment, leather, and inklong, preserved by desert air, now faced mold, rot, and mildew. Suddenly, the challenge wasn't burning, but decay. A new kind of librarian work began. Volunteers used hairdryers, fans, tweezers, and silica gel packets to dry and preserve the manuscripts. Boxes were stacked in closets and under beds. Families once again became stewards of knowledge, not in grand libraries, but in living rooms and backyards. Conservators and the quiet fixers to prevent further loss. International support eventually arrived. But for a long time, the people doing the work were local artisans, trained in binding, sewing, repairing water damage, and carefully separating pages stuck together by heat or moisture. Sometimes the tools were handmade, spoons flattened, paper fibers, cotton swabs, cleaned mold. Ink was rinked with handmade brushes to make faded calligraphy legible again. They worked in silence. Not for news crews or YouTube documentaries, but because the books needed them. And always the same rule applied. No page was ever discarded, even the damaged pieces. The half-crumbled corners of theology or poetry were stored in envelopes and marked with notes. A broken text was still a living text. Libraries today, still not lost as of today, many of those manuscripts have been digitized. Projects around the world, from the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota to UNESCO, have worked with Malians to scan and preserve these texts. But still, thousands remain hidden. Some are buried in family trunks, others rest beneath floors or behind false walls. The people of Mali, especially in the old quarters of Timbuktu, are still deciding when the world is ready for what they've held close for centuries. And for good reason. These books are not just historic. They contain commentary on governance, medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and ethics that are still relevant. They show that Afrikaans, wrongly excluded from conversations about intellectual history, was once a beacon of scholarship, literacy, and debate. The caravan never stops. Picture a line of camels in the night, somewhere outside the gates of Timbuktu. Each one carries not salt or gold, but a few manuscripts in a satchel slung across its side. That image isn't fictional. For centuries it happened in real life. And in a way, it's still happening, just with USB drives and solar chargers now, tucked beside the ancient texts. The journey continues. The caravan of knowledge still moves, quietly, slowly, dust-free. As you drift off, let your mind return to those mud walls, the quiet scholars brushing off sand, and the soft murmur of a lesson being copied. A city that once shimmered not with palaces but with pages, and now resting beside a flickering digital screen or humming fan, you might ask. What other libraries are out there? Forgotten, but not gone? What stories still live inside closed books, just waiting for the dust to settle? You might not have thought of it before, but the next time you're standing on a highway overpass or driving down a smooth, paved lane, know this: you're traveling in the shadow of Roman feet. Yes, the Romans, builders of colosseums, aqueducts, and empires, also built roads, long ones, thousands of miles of them. But here's the part they don't teach in school. Many of these legendary roads weren't perfectly straight. They were deliberately curved, just slightly. Just enough to confuse a modern engineer. Why? Well, to answer that, we must start with a question the Romans themselves would have asked. What makes a road eternal? Roads before Rome. A muddy affair before Rome took over road building. Getting from point A to B was. Pre-Roman Europe, roads were more like worn footpaths, created by repetition. Farmers walked their oxen along the same line to the fields. Traders took the same rutted trails through the woods. When it rained, and it always rained, they sank into the mud. In winter, the frost heaved the ground like a breathing beast, shifting paths without warning. The Greeks had roads, but few were paved. The Persians had the royal road, but it served empires, not villagers. And so the Romans, in their usual way, said, "We can do better, and it will last forever." The process, stones, sweat, and precision. To understand why their roads were slightly curved, we first have to understand how they built them. Imagine a legion of Roman soldiers, not in battle, but with picks, shovels, and chisels. These weren't construction workers. They were trained soldiers, and part of their duty was to build infrastructure as they advanced. In other words, Roman expansion was paved into existence. Here's how a Roman road was built. Surveying the path. Roman surveyors, known as grammatici, used simple but effective tools like the gramma, a T-shaped cross with plumb lines to determine the line of the road. They wanted as straight a path as possible, but sometimes they allowed for gentle curves. Digging the trench. A trench was dug, sometimes several feet deep, depending on terrain. Layering the foundation. Stamen, large stones at the bottom. Rutas, a layer of crushed stone or gravel. Nucleus, a finer layer of sand, clay, and lime. Summum dorsum, the final paved surface, often made of stone slabs fitted like puzzle pieces. This structure was both durable and draining. Rainwater flowed off the crown, the curved surface, and down into side ditches. And yet, some of these straight roads, when viewed from above, curve, bend, and angle gently over long distances. So why? The truth about straight roads' popular imagination says Roman roads were always perfectly straight. And yes, in segments, they often were, especially across flatland. But real Roman engineers knew something that modern people often forget. The world isn't flat. Across hills, valleys, forests, rivers, and shifting soil, a rigid straight line wasn't always the most reliable or sustainable path. So, the Roman solution. Gentle horizontal curvature, what we might call a deflection. These curves reduced gravitational stress on long, sloping roads, prevented water pooling in flat areas, allowed for easier drainage and lower maintenance, helped accommodate natural terrain without expensive excavation. In short, these roads look straight, but they were engineered with subtle flexibilities, because eternal doesn't mean stubborn, it means smart. Curves for the carts. There's another reason Roman roads curved ever so slightly, and it has nothing to do with topography. Wheel ruts. In the city of Pompeii, you can still see them, deep grooves, carved by years of wagon travel. But here's the catch. Curved roads reduce the wear on wheels and axles. Think about it. A completely straight road encourages speed and monotony. Wagons and carts, especially when overloaded, would roll in perfect lines and quickly carve deep ruts. Over time, these ruts would trap wheels, increase breakage, and demand more repairs. But a gentle curve forces micro-corrections in steering, shifting pressure on wheels, less rutting in any single groove. So while it sounds counterintuitive, the slightly curved Roman roads were actually more resilient to traffic than insight modern road designers, rediscovered centuries later. Vision and visibility. Roman engineers also used curves to control visibility for safety, communication, and surprise. A curve around a hillside might allow travelers to see approaching riders long before they meet. Curves near cities were sometimes aligned to reveal dramatic views, temples, gates, or forums just as you rounded the bend. In military campaigns, curves could conceal troop movements, making ambushes or withdrawals more effective. One famous example? The Via Appia, or Appian Waper, perhaps the most famous Roman road, features long, dramatic stretches with subtle arc-like segments, especially near Rome. To the eye it seems straight, but on closer inspection, it's not. Every stone had a purpose. A lesser-known but wonderfully boring fact: Roman engineers marked individual paving stones with quarry symbols, labor crews, or even instructions. Some stones bear the names of local governors who funded segments of the road. Others have grooves cut into them for traction. Occasionally, you'll even find a drainage spout carved directly into the stone, no wider than your thumb, letting water slip beneath and away from the surface. And then there's the camber, the slight arch across the road's width. This wasn't a flaw, it was intentional. A raised center allowed rain to run off efficiently to side ditches, so if you were walking barefoot, you'd feel a soft slope. To each step, nothing dramatic, but enough to guide water, slow erosion, and protect the roadbed. Even boredom was designed.
Lasting for millennia.
The best proof of Roman road design. Many of them still exist, not as highways, but as stone paths, used by shepherds, cyclists, and curious travelers. Some Roman roads still guide the layout of modern cities. London, Paris, Cologne, Milan form the invisible skeleton of road networks across France, Spain, the Balkans, and North Africa. In fact, engineers in Italy have excavated Roman roads buried 10 feet underground, still intact, still draining, still crowned with their camber, still faintly curved. And this leads to a question that even modern designers must ask. Did the Romans overbuild? Perhaps, but they believed in legacy, not just utility. Their slightly curved roads weren't the fastest, the cheapest, or even the most dramatic. Were simply the most likely to last as night settles over the stones. Somewhere beneath your feet, perhaps under a highway or a farmer's field, an old Roman road lies waiting. Its stones no longer feel the wheels of chariots or the sandals of legionnaires, but they're still there, quiet, curved, and resting, exactly where they were placed. And you may wonder, how many footsteps passed down those roads, never recorded? How many messages carried by foot or hoof turned the tides of empires? How many curves were deliberate, not accidental, and how many lives followed those arcs? The road behind you stretches in silence, its stone shoulders resting beneath millennia of sun and rain. You've seen how the Romans built with purpose, how their slight curves were whispers of longevity, not flaws, but strategies. But now let's leave the stone behind and shift focus onto the people who walk those roads. Because the real history of Roman roads is not only about engineering, but about movement mail carriers with scrolls, soldiers in iron boots, merchants with camels, fugitives, pilgrims, tax collectors, and even emperors in littered carriages bumping over paved stones. And everywhere they went, they followed the same guiding logic, etched into stone and ink, the Roman system of milestones and maps. The mile that mattered. Let's begin with something so ordinary you might miss it. The milestone. All along the great Roman roads, starting just outside the gates of Rome, the empire planted thousands of stone markers called miliaria. Each stood like a quiet, boring soldier round, or rectangular, waist-high or taller, carved. With abbreviations and chipped Latin inscriptions, they weren't ornamental, they were infrastructure, and everyone told a story. A typical milestone might read, Impques Vesp, AVG2, Cos DC 3 PP 15 M Pomp. Translation, if your Latin is a little rusty, Emperor Caesar Vespasian Augustus. In his second consulship, designated for the third father of his country. 15 miles to Pompeii, these stones served multiple purposes. Measured distances from a central reference point, the golden milestone miliarium aureum in the Forum of Rome, gave credit to the emperor or governor who commissioned that stretch of road, indicated directions and destinations, marked repairs and repavings. Sometimes centuries later, can still find them today, not just in Italy, but in France, Turkey, Syria, and Britain. Some have fallen sideways into the earth. Others are still upright, quiet markers of forgotten miles. All roads lead to Rome. It wasn't just a slogan. It was literally measurably true. Via Romanatha, Roman roads, were built with Rome as their origin. And not figuratively, they measured every mile away from the city center, like the rings of a tree. This made logistics, military planning, and taxation possible across an empire that stretched from the Red Sea to the North Sea. A person in Gaul, Egypt, or Hispania could follow the milestones and calculate their exact distance from the capital. This centrality did more than measure space. It reinforced an idea. Rome is the heart. And you, wherever you are, on the edge of the empire or in its center, are connected to it. The cursus publicus. Rome's state mail system, Roman roads weren't just for troops and travelers. They were also the veins of the empire's information system, the cursus publicus, the official state mail service. This wasn't mail as we know it, no birthday cards or tax rebates. It was for official imperial decrees, messages between governors, intelligence from military commanders, reports from census-takers, orders for grain, taxes, or soldiers' couriers were called coursors or tabulari, and they rode fast horses or mules, along roads optimized for speed. Every 8 to 10 miles there was a mutations, a changing station where fresh mounts and riders awaited. Every 20 to 30 miles they reached a mansio, a rest house with food, sleeping quarters, stables, and sometimes small garrisons. Only the state could use this system. But that didn't stop bribery. Wealthy individuals and merchants often paid off officials to smuggle their own messages or packages via the cursus. Even the most powerful generals had to fight to get their messages prioritized. One letter from a governor in Egypt reads, "If this reaches you in less than 3 weeks, thank my bribe to the stablemaster." The empire ran on these messages. Roads weren't just for movement, they were data pipelines, built in stone, mapping the empire. The Puchinger table now that we have the roads and the milestones. What about maps? The Romans didn't carry paper maps like modern travelers, but they had something even stranger and more fascinating. In the 13th century, a scribe copied an ancient Roman artifact, the tabula Putingeria, or Putinger table. This wasn't a map in the geographic sense. It was a schematic, a long, rolled parchment over 20 feet in length, showing the Roman world as a transit diagram. Cities were dots, roads were lines. Mountains looked like cartoon humps. Rivers curved like ropes. But every road, milestone, and stop was recorded with relative distances and names. Think of it as the subway map of the empire, distorted, abstract, but endlessly practical. This map let Roman officials plan travel routes, troop movements, and grain shipments. It may not have been precise, but it was functional. And even its odd shape, long and thin, suggests how Roman travel worked, by stages, not regions. You didn't need to know where something was. You needed to know how to get there. The people on the road, of course. Not everyone traveled for politics or war. Plenty of ordinary people walked Roman roads. Pilgrims on their way to shrines in Gaul or Judea, retired soldiers moving to the land grants they received, traders with carts filled with glass, salt, perfume, wine, or clay pots, runaway slaves hoping the open road might bring them freedom or anonymity, entertainers and gladiators traveling from city to city for games, farmers headed to market, with baskets balanced on their backs. These travelers followed the same milestones, stayed in the same mansionese, and saw the same curved roads disappearing over the horizon. There was even an official guidebook, a Roman itinerary called the Itinerarium Antonini. It listed stations, towns, and distances like a modern highway exit list. One entry reads, from Luganum to Airlate, 53 miles. From Airlate to Massilia, 62 miles. Massilia to Forum Iuli, 60 miles. Imagine flipping through this, planning your journey. No smartphone, no map app, just stone, memory, and sandals. Travel, taxes, and tolls, not everything was free. To use certain bridges or road segments, travelers sometimes paid tolls, especially near wealthy cities. Others encountered tax inspectors. Who checked carts for undeclared goods? Traveler status changed their experience. A Roman citizen might pass with ease. A provincial might face harassment or detention. A slave might need a travel permit to Sahara just to walk legally. And yet, The road remained open, quiet, and uncaring. No matter who stepped on its stones, it stretched out ahead, indifferent, but constant. Footsteps in dust, we don't always think of roads as emotional spaces. But for Roman travelers, they were often charged with meaning. The road to Rome meant ambition. The road from Rome could mean exile. The road to the front meant danger. The road home meant survival. Poets wrote of these feelings. A few lines from a Roman tombstone read, "He left on the Appian road, smiling and singing. He returned in silence, ashes in an urn. Even in stone, the road had memory." As you drift along the stones, picture it now, a curved Roman road. Under moonlight, miles from any city, traveler asleep by the milestone, head resting on a travel sack, sandals beside him. Somewhere beyond the bend, another courier rides. Beyond him, a soldier walks. Beyond him, a letter waits to be delivered. And beyond all of them, Rome always, Rome all goes, faintly in the mind. And so you may wonder, how many stories were never told because they were lost between milestones? How many moments of love, fear, relief, or decision took place right there, on the curve of a road built 2,000 years ago? By now, you've walked the stone paths, past the milestones, and watched the couriers and citizens of ancient Rome come and go. You've seen how slight curves were deliberate, how they guided drainage and traffic, and how they stitched together a world that spanned deserts, mountains, and seas. But like all roads, even Rome's had an end. And in this final section, we ask what happens when the road builder leaves, and the empire falls, but the roads remain. The cracking of the stones, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, didn't happen in one night, as storytellers like to imagine. There was no single moment where a final torch was snuffed and all went dark. Instead, the decline came in slow, crumbling gestures. Local governors stopped maintaining the roads. Legions were recalled or disbanded. Road crews no longer paid. Took up other trades. In many cases, the administrative knowledge where milestones led, which roads were still safe, simply faded away. The result was something almost eerie, a landscape full of roads. But no one left to walk them, and many roads remained physically intact. Their stones didn't vanish. But without maintenance, brush grew up along their edges. Culverts clogged. Weeds poked between paving slabs. The curves no longer drained, and the world slowly moved around them. Roads reclaimed by nature in places. Like Gaul, modern-day France, and Britannia, Britain, farmers began to use old Roman roads as property boundaries. A wide Roman road might become a cow path or the edge of a grain field. In forested regions, trees reclaimed the roadbeds. Vines reached across milestones. In time, some roads vanished completely, known only through half-remembered names or local legends. Yet some Roman roads survived in disguise. A modern highway in Spain, built over the Via Augusta, a farm track in northern France, once part of the Via Agrippa, a small street in a British town, still follows the path laid down by Roman surveyors 1,800 years ago with the same subtle curve, worn into place by centuries of wagons. The roads, though abandoned, continued to shape how people moved, even if they no longer knew who built them or why. From pagan roads to pilgrim paths, interestingly, some Roman roads gained new life during the Middle Ages, not from armies, but from pilgrims. As Christianity spread, roads once built for legions and governors were now walked by monks, penitents, and seekers. Many famous pilgrimage routes, such as the Camino de Santiago, partially followed ancient Roman paths. Churches were built beside old mansions. Monasteries grew up at old crossroads. Pilgrims followed the same curves and paused at the same resting points. Even as the Roman gods faded, the roads carried new faiths, new prayers, and new meanings. The stones become something else. Some people didn't just walk the old roads, they took them apart. As cities shrank and needed building materials, many looked to the Roman roads for easy stone. In medieval towns, Roman paving slabs were lifted and repurposed as foundation. Stones for churches, as steps in castles, as grave markers, cut down and engraved anew in one French village. Archaeologists found a Roman milestone used as a millstone in a farmer's barn. In another, pieces of the Via Ignatia were embedded in a Gothic cathedral's floor. This recycling wasn't vandalism. It was practicality. The empire was gone, but the stone remained. And stone is never idle, it waits to be shaped again. Barbarian boots on Roman roads, even the so-called barbarians who invaded Roman lands, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and others, used the roads. They followed the same curves and marched over the same causeways. Many of them respected the Roman infrastructure, even if they didn't understand its full scale. Some tried to maintain what they could. Others merely traveled the paths, their journeys etched lightly over the stones that once bore emperors. A few even buried their dead beside. Roman roads graves marked not with Latin inscriptions, but with simple stones, animal bones, or jewelry. Imagine that now. A child of a Frankish warlord walking beside a road his ancestors never built, watching weeds grow in cracks they never paved and still knowing it led somewhere. The medieval patchwork by the time the High Middle Ages arrived. Roman roads had become mysteries. People still walked them, of course. Some roads even became central avenues in emerging medieval towns, but few knew who built them. Myths grew up that giants had laid the stones, that the old gods once rode the roads, that hidden treasure lay buried beneath the milestones. In a monastery in Germany, a monk once described an ancient road as being too perfect to have been made by men, and yet farmers still used them, travelers still followed them, merchants still trusted their curves. The Roman roads, like ghosts, continued to guide without speaking. The Renaissance rediscovers the roads by the 15th century, scholars in Italy, and France began rediscovering Roman ruins, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and yes, roads. They studied the layout. They read old texts like Vitruvius and Frontinus to understand Roman engineering. Slowly, roads that had been dismissed as relics became models again. Mapmakers began tracing the ancient paths. Cities used them as templates for expanding infrastructure. In the 18th century, Napoleon used segments of old Roman roads to plan troop movements. Even today, Google Maps shows highways that bend and curve exactly where Roman roads once did. Curves that once drained water, now drain traffic. Engineers, ancient lessons in recent decades, civil engineers have begun reevaluating the wisdom of Roman road building. Studies show gently curved roads reduce driver fatigue. Subtle arcs improve visibility in fog and rain. Crowned surfaces with curved drains remain effective millennia later. Some of the most boring design choices, those dull, slightly bent paths, turn out to be the most sustainable. So modern roads, with all our sensors and satellites, still echo the subtle choices of Roman engineers. They remind us, the road that lasts is rarely the road that insists on being straight. One last mile. So now, as we conclude this second story, imagine yourself again on a Roman road at dusk. The breeze moves gently across its surface. In the fading light, the path ahead isn't a straight line, it bends slightly, disappearing behind a hill. You walk on, not knowing what lies beyond the curve, but trusting that the stones beneath your feet were laid with care, long before your time. And so you may ask, what curves have guided us unknowingly through history? What quiet hands shaped the paths we still walk today? In the quiet woods of medieval Japan, where mist hangs low among pine trees and the only sounds are the tapping of Gita sandals and the soft flutter of a silken kimono, an old man bends over a plank of sakura wood. With practiced hands, he writes. Not a poem, but a tax record. And then just as carefully he splits it clean in half. Half he keeps, the other half he gives away. This was not a mistake. This was governing. And this little slip of split wood, called a han or tag in some periods, was one of the cleverest bureaucratic tools in history, a non-forgeable tax receipt. But to understand how it worked and why it was needed, we must first walk deep into the Japanese countryside, past the castles and samurai, and down into the fields of rice and ink and timber. because this is not a story of emperors. It's a story of paperwork. The bureaucracy beneath the blossoms we tend to imagine feudal. Japan is a land of duels, scrolls, and tea ceremonies, but in between the romance, it was also a land of intense paperwork. By the Nara period, 8th century CE, and especially during the Heian period 794 to 1185 CE, Japan's central government had developed a sophisticated system of land registration, taxation, and auditing. Much of this system was inspired at least at first by Chinese administrative models from the Tang dynasty. Japan says Ritsuryo, legal codes laid out in detail, how land was to be divided, how much tax each farmer owed, what kind of produce was acceptable, how that tax was to be recorded and verified. Here lies the problem. Paper was rare, ink was expensive, transport over long distances was dangerous. So how could you prove a tax had been paid? Enter the wooden tallies. The solution came from the forests. Simple wooden sticks, carved and marked, then split in half lengthwise so that each half bore identical grain patterns and markings. These split tally sticks, known by various names across eras, including kifuda or tagada, were created at the time of tax collection. Let's say a farmer delivered his quota of rice in bags of unhulled grain to the local granary. A tax official would carve a wooden strip with the date, name, and quantity. Score or mark it with unique symbols or cuts. Split it down the middle. Keep one half as the official record. Give the other half to the taxpayer. Each half alone was useless. But brought together, they would match perfectly, both in writing and in the grain of the wood. Forgery? Almost impossible. Even if you copied the marks, you couldn't replicate the grain. This system, used in varying forms across centuries of Japanese history, it's made corruption far more difficult and ensured that rural tax compliance could be tracked without full-scale bureaucracy. It was paperwork that didn't need paper. The peasant and his half now. Picture the farmer again. He goes home with his half of the stick. He wraps it in cloth and hides it in the rafters of his house or buries it in a pot beneath the floor. He may be illiterate, but he knows what this piece of wood means. He won't be taxed twice if an official ever accuses him of failing to deliver his quota. He can pull out the stick and say, "Here, match it." This was power, not swords or coin, but the ability to say no. The split stick gave common people a defense against overreach, and so these little wooden records became precious household relics, sometimes passed from father to son. In some regions, they even developed decorative traditions, carving them with family marks or adding burn marks to prevent tampering. When the system changed as the centuries turned, Japan's governance shifted. The rise of the samurai class during the Kamakura period, followed by the long stretch of shogunate rule, altered tax collection. In some eras, taxes were collected in kind, rice, silk, or timber. In others, they shifted to money-based systems. But the idea of split proof persisted. In some places, temples used similar systems to track donations. Others used split wooden tickets to record debts or contracts. Even the famous Ai Shrine, one of the holiest Shinto sites, recorded certain donations via wooden tallies. By the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, when Japan was relatively stable and more urbanized, the use of paper-based receipts increased. But in rural areas, wood remained king. Sometimes it wasn't even a stick of wooden tablet, tag, or paddle. Sometimes, with intricate stamps, served as a hybrid receipt and ledger. A bureaucratic balance of trust. What makes this story so uniquely boring and wonderful is its mundane brilliance. These weren't documents of poetry or law. They weren't beautiful. They weren't even legible to most people. They worked. They show us that systems don't need to be high-tech to be tamper-proof. That trust and verification can be embedded in humble things. That even in a pre-modern society, accountability mattered. And most of all, they remind us that history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about small, clever systems that kept the rice moving and the taxes honest. The forest connection. It's worth noting that Japan has always had a unique relationship with trees. Temples were built from cedar and cypress, prized for their scent and durability. Shinto shrines are dedicated to sacred groves where trees themselves are worshipped. So it's no surprise that the material used for tax records wood was treated with a degree of respect. Some receipts were burned in ritual after final audits. Others were placed in shrine storehouses, as if asking the gods to bless the transaction. It was, in its way, a kind of spiritual bureaucracy. As the wood splits in your mind, imagine. The soft crack of a stick splitting lengthwise, the smell of fresh cedar or cherry as it's pulled apart. One half was handed to a farmer, one half sealed away in a ledger. And now, centuries later, archaeologists find these broken halves still matching, still whispering their silent truths. And you may wonder, what simple tools today forgotten by tomorrow will still fit perfectly into a future we can't? Yet see, as the cherry blossoms gave way to summer rains and then to the golden silence of autumn, the wooden tax sticken, or fudarim, in the corner of a farmer's hut, nestled beside tools or in a beam above the hearth. It didn't look like much. Just a sliver of cedar or cypress or paulownia wood. But in that sliver was trust, memory, and a delicate form of governance. Section 1 brought us into the world of the split wooden tax receipt, used by ordinary citizens in feudal Japan to prove payment and defend themselves from false claims. Now, we journey further not just through rice fields and tax stations, but into the temples, archives, and philosophies that made the system sustainable for centuries. Where rice meets ritual, temples as tax hubs, it might surprise you to learn that many tax collections weren't handled directly by state officials, especially in later periods. Instead, the great temples of Japan, massive religious and administrative institutions like Todaiji in Nara or Kafukuji in Yamato, acted as regional tax centers. These weren't just spiritual sanctuaries, were landholders, landlords, and record keepers. In fact, some temples controlled entire provinces worth of farmland. And how did they track what was owed? You guessed it, split sticks. Farmers delivering rice or textiles to the temple granary would receive one half of a wooden tag, often stamped with the temple seal and carved with Sanskrit-inspired symbols or Buddhist prayers. It was both a receipt and a blessing. Sometimes, monks stored their matching halves in rotating wooden drawers, organized by province, season, and year. This quiet, dust-heavy system continued year after year, century after century. To the monk, it was bookkeeping. To the farmer, it was peace of mind. To history, it was invisibilant till someone unearthed a stick from the soil and realized it still matched another found in the temple archives. Two halves of the same wooden truth. When paper failed, wood remained. Japan did use paper tax documents. Of course, especially as printing and literacy spread during the Edo period. But paper had vulnerabilities. It burned easily in Japan's wooden paper homes. It molded in humid summers. It was fragile, and ink would fade. Wood, by contrast, was resilient. A cedar stick could survive damp winters and careless handling. Even when scorched, the grain and shape would remain recognizable. It's why it would continue to be used long after paper became common, especially in remote villages, mountain hamlets, or among the itinerant workers who needed tangible proof of a transaction but lacked the means to store delicate scrolls. In fact, some officials preferred wooden records. In a 17th century local ordinance, a magistrate in northern Honshu wrote, "The peasant may forget a number. He may misplace a paper, but he does not forget the feel of his stick." How the sticks were designed, let's pause for a moment and look at the design of a typical Edo period wooden tax receipt. Imagine a stick about the length of your forearm, sometimes wider than your thumb. Carved from cedar or cypress, it would be scored lengthwise to allow an even split. Carved or stamped with the year-using era names like Kane or Genroku, the taxpayer's village, and name or household symbol. If illiterate, the type and quantity of goods delivered, for example, 3 bales of rice, a seal of the local official or temple. Representatives sometimes decorated with burn marks, ink brush strokes, or grooves to discourage substitution or tampering. Then it would be split in half, sometimes with a chisel, sometimes with a special bamboo wedge, both halves examined. If they matched exactly, the transaction was sealed. The system had a built-in charm. No two pieces of wood ever split quite the same way twice. The philosophy beneath the practice Japanese. Systems of administration have always reflected philosophical and aesthetic traditions, especially those rooted in Shinto and Zen thought. The split stick, while utilitarian, also held a symbolic value. It represented shared responsibility. It acknowledged the impermanence of paper and memory, grounded governance in natural materials, not distant authority. There was something deeply Shinto about using wood for records. In Shintoism, the boundary between nature and spirit is thin. A tree holds meaning. A carved object contains intent. Even the act of splitting of making two things from one echoed. Ideas of balance, mirror worlds, and interdependence. So this was not just bureaucracy. It was a system in tune with the rhythm of the land. What happened to the sticks? Many of the surviving tax sticks have been found, in temple archives, sometimes. Stored alongside ancient scrolls, in granary pits, where records were buried during transitions of power, in forgotten attics wrapped in cloth and tucked behind beams, in archaeological digs remarkably well preserved beneath the earth. Historians examining these sticks often find matching pairs, sometimes separated by centuries, and stored in completely different prefectures. Some even contain incomplete markings, leading to fascinating puzzles. Did the farmer lose his half? Was the tax contested? Did the stick get broken prematurely? One researcher described these as the footnotes of the farmer's life. Stick is a sentence, and together they form a grammar of accountability. Samurai ledgers. And control even the samurai class, the supposed warriors of high honor, lied on these sticks for local governance. Samurai serving as local daimyo lords or hatamoto direct retainers maintained wooden tallies as part of their rural management. They used them to track village yields, monitor tenant obligations, verify grain shipments to castle towns. In some cases, these samurai employed scribes who specialized in woodwork craftsmen who could shape, score, and preserve tax sticks in water-sealed boxes. In a world where written contracts could be disputed, a matching stick spoke without argument. The sound of wood against wood. It's late in the year. The harvest has been collected. A village elder, with a crooked back and gray in his hair, sits before a low lacquered table. From a wooden drawer, he pulls out a tax stick. He runs his fingers along its edges, then slowly retrieves its matching half from a silk pouch brought by a farmer. He holds them together. They match. No words need to be said. No ink needs to flow. Just the quiet sound of wood touching wood. And a nod of acknowledgement. And you may ask, what other truths once proven no longer need repeating, only remembering? You've walked alongside rice farmers and temple scribes, traced the grain of cedar sticks marked with era names and offerings, and seen how these split wooden records once formed a quiet, resilient web of trust across medieval Japan. But what happens when a system that relies on simplicity meets a world that demands speed? What happens when governments evolve, technology advances, and a stick once sacred and binding is no longer enough? In this final section, we trace the gentle decline of the wooden tax receipt and what its disappearance tells us about how societies let go not with fanfare, but with silence. The slow erosion of a system by the mid-1800s. Japan was beginning to strain under the weight of its own traditions. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had enforced relative peace, closed society, and a strict social hierarchy. In that time, population grew, urban centers expanded, and commerce accelerated. Where once a village might have had one tax collector and a few dozen receipts per year, larger towns now required hundreds of records and faster ways to track and enforce payments. Wood, sturdy and clever as it was, simply couldn't scale. Add to that rising literacy among merchants and samurai classes who began demanding written contracts. The spread of ink printing presses made large volume paperwork more feasible, and increased reliance on monetary taxation rather than good seen kind. More bureaucratic oversight from Edo modern Tokyo, requiring standardized paper forms. Suddenly, the humble wooden stick, once perfect for rice and barley and bolts of silk, was out of place in a system asking for scrolls, seals, and signatures. The transition was not violent. It was gradual, quiet, almost imperceptible. Year, a village issued 80 wooden receipts. The next year, only 40. By the third year, they were gone. And no one wrote down the date when the last one was split. It's the Meiji Restoration. A new era of order in 1868, everything changed. The Tokugawa shogunate fell, and the Meiji government began rapidly modernizing Japan politically, industrially, and socially. In less than 2 decades, Japan transformed from a feudal state to a centralized nation-state with national currency railways, formal taxation laws, a Western-style legal system, and in this new system, there was no room for half a stick. The Meiji government introduced a land tax reform in 1873 that demanded taxes are paid in money, not rice. It's nationally issued tax receipts. Printed on standardized paper, a uniform registry of property ownership, the logic was modern, efficient, and irreversible. From that moment on, even the most remote villages were drawn into a world of ink, ledgers, and bureaucratic stamps. And so, the split-stick system, once perfectly suited for a land of small fields and mountain shrines, faded from living memory. The disappearance, what happened to the sticks? Most were discarded, used as kindling, left to rot, or simply forgotten in rafters, rice sheds, and temple boxes. Some, ironically, were split again, not to prove anything, but to be broken down into wooden combs or chopsticks. Few sticks survived purely by accident, sealed in temple archives and left untouched for 150 years. Buried in the corners of storehouses, preserved by dryness and dust, rediscovered in archaeological digs, often mistaken for kindling until examined more closely. And then slowly, scholars realized what they had found. One researcher in Kyoto described unearthing a pair of matching tax sticks from the late Edo period. When placed together, the inscriptions aligned. The year, Tenpo Shiryi, the location, Mino Province, a name half-erased, but still legible. They fit so perfectly that the grain itself flowed like water across the divide. Even after centuries underground, the system still worked. Lessons in simplicity, modern societies often chase complexity. Databases, algorithms, redundancy. And yet, the splitwood tax receipt reminds us that durability doesn't require complexity only. Clarity and honesty. Why did the system work so well? It matched physical proof to human memory. It used natural materials readily available to everyone. It decentralized accountability. No one needed a master ledger. It created a system that was resistant to forgery and decay. It allowed the illiterate to participate in bureaucracy with confidence. In today's digital world, such elegance is rare. We hide our records in clouds, servers, and blockchains. But imagine a system that didn't need a password only. A tree, a knife, and 2 honest hands. The researchers puzzled today, historians and archaeologists still collect and catalog these sticks. In university archives in Tokyo, Nara, and Sapporo, drawers filled with split cedar receipts sit under soft lighting. Some are incomplete, others are broken. But many remain in perfect pairs. Scholars now examine them like puzzles. Who wrote them? Where did they come from? What does that smudged mark mean? Why was this stick stamped twice? One recent project even used digital scanning in 3D, modeling to reconstruct warped sticks and rematch them with long separated halves found in different regions. In 2023, researchers successfully reunited 2 halves of a tax receipt from the Genroku era 1688 to 1704, one found in a Kyoto temple, the other buried in a field near Nagoya. The sticks had been separated for over 300 years. An ancient handshake, they still knew each other. As the grain runs on, picture it now. A quiet farmhouse, empty for a century. In the beams above the hearth, tucked behind a dusty support, rests a single strip of woods, lightly scorched, faintly inscribed. Its other half lies in a museum drawer, far away, labeled with caution and care. But once, just once, sat together in the hands of a man who grew rice and needed proof of his work. And so we ask ... What systems have we left behind, not because they failed, but because we simply outgrew their patience? And what might we learn, even now, from a stick split, clean in two? In the golden heat of an ancient Egyptian morning, somewhere on the west bank of the Nile, not far from the Valley of the Kings, a boy sits in the shade of a limestone cliff. His hands are dusty, his brush is clumsy, his scroll is not a scroll. It's a shard of broken pottery and ostrakhan, the humble training, the ground of some of the greatest painters in history. Before he can ever touch a tomb wall, before his brush is allowed to apply even a whisper of ochre or lapis lazuli to the resting place of a pharaoh, his apprentice must copy line after line of symbols, ayahs, falcons, lotus blossoms, scrap material, over and over again. Because in ancient Egypt, mistakes were not acceptable, not in death, not in eternity. And so begins a story not of pyramids or treasure, but of practice, the quiet, dusty, relentless practice of those who made the afterlife beautiful. The painters of the afterlife. To understand why practice mattered so much, you need to understand the job of a tomb painter. These were not casual artisans. They were part of an elite class of craftspeople known as servants. In the place of truth, a community of scribes, masons, draftsmen, and painters who lived in a specially built village called Deir el-Medina, established during the New Kingdom around 1550 to 1070 BCE. Their role? To build and decorate the royal tombs tucked deep into the cliffs of Theban necropolises. But not just decorate. These painters were expected to translate eternity into pigment, to tell stories of the dead, ensure their safe passage to the next world, and honor a strict visual language full of symmetry, sacred geometry, and coded symbolism. A crooked eyebrow, a misplaced glyph, an incorrectly drawn hand. That wasn't just sloppy work. That was a spiritual risk. So how did they avoid mistakes? By never training on the final surface? The ostrakhan, Egypt scratch paper instead. Of practicing on papyrus stew expensive ore on tomb walls, two sacred Egyptian apprentices practiced on astraka. An ostrakhan, plural astraka, is simply a broken piece of pottery or limestone flake, often with one flat side, used like scrap paper. It might have once been part of a water jar, a basin, or a wall tile. After breaking, it gained new life as a canvas for study. Straka came in all shapes and sizes, and they weren't just used by painters. Scribes used them to practice writing or copy poetry. Architects sketched measurements. Tax collectors noted figures. Artists traced images. But in Deir el-Medina, hundreds of astraka have been found covered in sketches of gods, pharaohs, daily life scenes, and even full hieroglyphic texts. These were studies, sometimes perfect, often awkward, the work of learners, of hands trying to become steady. How tomb painters learned their craft. Becoming a tomb painter was a slow, almost meditative process. Most apprentices were sons of painters or scribes, born into the community and apprenticed early. Very specific path. Copying from models, senior painters would prepare idealized template drawings of Anubis, Ra, or ceremonial scenes. Apprentices copied them repeatedly onto astraka until they could reproduce them by memory. Line control using a reed brush and ink, they practiced drawing straight lines, curves, and borders essential for the precise visual framing of tomb art. Coloring within outlines. Once they mastered form, they were taught how to fill shapes with consistent color using natural pigments ground on palettes. Symmetry practice. Many scenes in tombs required mirrored images, left and right sides identical. Apprentices practiced symmetry drawing sometimes, dividing their astraka with faint grids. Spacing and hieroglyph proportion. The relationship between word and image mattered greatly. Hieroglyphs were treated as art. Each needed to be balanced and spaced, often to divine proportions. This too was learned on astraka. Only after years of copying, coloring, and correcting would an apprentice be invited to contribute to an actual tomb wall, often starting with backgrounds or assisting in paint mixing. The master painter, or chief draftsman, would oversee everything. Tombs were permanent. Practice wasn't. Unlike modern art studios, ancient Egyptian tomb painters worked in service of eternity. Their murals weren't meant to be viewed by the living, but by the gods, the soul of the deceased, and time itself. So perfection wasn't aesthetic, was cosmic, and perfection couldn't be left to chance. That's why no freehand experiments were ever allowed on sacred walls. Instead, designs were first sketched in red ink. A master would correct them in black ink. The outlines were carved into the plaster or stone. The Ndoni then was paint applied. If anything needed to be learned, explored, or improved, it was done beforehand, quietly, repeatedly, on the humble surface of a discarded pottery shard. Archaeological gold. Modern archaeologists owe an enormous debt to these practice pieces. When Deir el-Medina was excavated in the 20th century, thousands of ostraca were found discarded in piles just outside the village. They told personal stories: a child's name scrawled by a proud father, a comic sketch of a lazy worker being scolded, a drawing of a cat chasing a goose, a repeated set of lines trying to get one single falcon glyph just right. These fragments, meant to survive now, offer one of the richest windows into daily artistic life in any ancient culture. They show that even in a civilization famous for its precision and grandeur, there was room for mistakes, learning, and humble beginnings. In the quiet of the workshop, it's early evening, the Nile breeze has cooled, an apprentice sits by. Oil lamp light, brush in hand, copying the same lotus petal for the 15th time. His father, a master painter, nods silently as he passes. Nearby, the finished tomb awaits its final layer of blue. But tonight, the real work happens here, on a broken piece of pottery, on a table smeared with ink and dust. The image is just slightly better than the last one, and you may wonder, what masterpieces have been born not from genius, but from the quiet patience of broken things? As twilight deepens over Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans, the apprentice sets aside his ostrakhan and reaches for his tools. Simple yet essential instruments that shaped the grandeur of ancient Egyptian tomb art without ever touching the sacred walls until ready. This section explores the tools, materials, and cultural traditions that underpin this careful training system. Turning raw talent into timeless craftsmanship. The palette of the painter, the colors that breathe life into tomb walls, came from the earth, carefully prepared and ground into pigments by the artisans. Red ochre, from iron-rich soil, used for skin tones and highlights. Yellow ochre, derived from hydrated iron oxide, for gold and sun imagery. Malachite, a green pigment mined from copper ores. Azurite and lapis lazuli, blues prized for their rarity and brilliance. Carbon black, from soot or charred bones. Gypsum white, ground calcium. Sulfate for highlights and mixing. Painters mixed pigments with a binding agent, usually gum arabic or a plant-based glue, to produce a smooth, lasting paint. Each pigment required careful preparation and storage. Apprentices learned how to grind minerals finely and mix colors consistently on stone palettes before applying them to their ostraca. The brush, in its making the reed brush, was the painter's primary tool. Made from stalks of rush plants or reeds gathered along the Nile, the brushes were cut to size, split at the tip into thin fibers, tied to wooden handles. With leather or string, apprentices often made their own brushes. Learning how fiber thickness and length affected line quality, whether for the thin outlines of hieroglyphs or the broad strokes filling large background areas, the brush required maintenance, rinsing in water, shaping with fingers, and proper storage to prevent mold. Master painters guarded the best brushes and sometimes gifted apprentices their own sets as a rite of passage. Grids and geometry, foundations of precision. Egyptian tomb art is famous for its proportions, figures rendered according to strict grids. Before any paint touched plaster or ostrakhan, the painter would draw grids, vertical and horizontal lines, dividing the surface into equal squares. These squares guided the placement of body parts and hieroglyphs. The proportions were often set to canonical ratios, such as 18 squares from head to feet, in human figures. Apprentices practiced drawing these grids meticulously on astraca, learning to balance rigid precision with artistic expression. Their training included exercises in symmetry, repetition, and spatial awareness, all crucial for the large-scale murals they would eventually paint. The role of the master painter in Deir al-Medina, the master painter, was both a teacher and a supervisor. He prepared the model astraca for copying. He corrected mistakes using red ink, indicating where lines should be refined. He decided when apprentices were ready to progress. Mistakes were not merely errors, they were lessons. A single mistake could mean scraping off paint or starting over on a new ostracon. Masters often told stories of their own struggles, encouraging patience and humility. They taught apprentices to view mistakes as necessary steps, not failures. Cultural respect for the craft painting tombs was a sacred duty. Apprentices learned that their art connected the living and the dead. They were not merely artists, they were keepers of the afterlife story. This belief inspired respect for the craft and the tools. Materials were never wasted. Astraca were reused when possible, when a practice piece was no longer needed. It might be discarded in a sacred pit or buried with offerings. This ritual care reinforced the idea that even practice was part of a larger cosmic order. The silent workshop, imagine the workshop, cool stone floors, faint Nile light filtering through reed blinds. The air is still, except for the soft scratch of reed brushes on pottery shards, the occasional murmur of correction from a master. The scent of pigment and gum arabic mingling with the dust. Apprentices work silently, focused on mastery. No paint is wasted, no wall defiled. This quiet diligence ensured that when the moment came to paint the tomb, every stroke was deliberate, every line true. As you let your eyes close and the scene fades, you may ask yourself, how many masterpieces in history were born, not from bold strokes, but from the patient copying of broken pottery? And what lessons in humility and craft might still be waiting on a forgotten shard? As the sun sets behind the Theban cliffs and the last embers of oil lamps flicker in the workshop, the apprentice, now a seasoned painter, prepares to leave his mark on a tomb wall. But before he can do so, he reflects on the years spent with humble shards. The countless lines drawn, erased, and redrawn, and the steady hands forged through patience. This final section traces the enduring legacy of those broken pottery pieces as Trakanand. Explores how the discipline and humility they fostered ensured that the tombs of Egypt would stand for millennia. Ostraca. The silent teachers, the ostraca, once simple tools of practice, became silent teachers of history. Their survival is a remarkable accident of time. While tomb walls faded, were vandalized, or eroded by wind and water, thousands of astraca discarded and forgotten have been unearthed, offering rare insight into the daily lives, skills, and even humor of ancient artisans. From scribbles of playful jokes to meticulously copied religious texts and delicate sketches of gods and animals, astraca tell us that the road to mastery was as much about repetition and learning as it was about talent, practice, and perfection. The ancient Egyptian concept of maorder, balance, and truth permeated every aspect of life, especially art. The astraca system embodied math not only in the results, but also in the process. By practicing on impermanent materials, painters honored the sacredness of the tomb walls. By accepting mistakes as steps to mastery, they embraced humility. This culture of patient practice reminds us that true skill is often the product of quiet, unseen effort rather than sudden inspiration. The transmission of knowledge, the system ensured that knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Apprentices learned from masters who had learned from masters before them. Even as dynasties rose and fell, the tools and techniques remained steady. This long tradition contributed to the remarkable consistency in Egyptian art across centuries. Figures, proportion the same, scenes composed with precise symbolism, and stories told with familiar motifs. Astraca were the notebooks of this tradition, proof that before the grand murals, there were thousands of humble sketches. Lessons for today? Modern artists and craftspeople might look at the astraca and see a lesson in patience. In an age of digital shortcuts and instant results, the ancient system reminds us of the value of practice without pressure. of learning through trial and error in spaces where mistakes don't cost us dearly. It also shows the power of material. Culture, how simple objects connect us to ideas larger than ourselves. Closing reflection picture once more, the apprentice, brush poised above a broken shard, eyes steady, heart calm. His strokes are measured, sure, not hurried. He is making mistakes but learning. He is preparing not just to paint a wall, but to contribute to an eternal story. And as you drift toward sleep, consider what broken shards in your own life might be waiting for patient hands, what masterpieces lie ahead, born from quiet repetition and steady care. Imagine the cold northern seas, the biting wind, and the relentless gray skies under which the Vikings lived. These hardy seafarers, known for their longships and fierce raids, were also surprisingly meticulous about a detail that might seem trivial today: their dental hygiene. In a time before toothbrushes and toothpaste, before dentists and fluoride, how did the Vikings keep their teeth clean? And why did they turn to such unusual materials as horsehoof powder and ash for their dental care? This story begins with an exploration of Viking daily life, the materials available to them, and the surprising science behind their tooth-cleaning habits. Life in Viking Age Scandinavia, the Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 CE, was a period defined by expansion, exploration, and cultural exchange. Yet, beneath the stories of conquests and voyages, the average Viking was a farmer, craftsman, or trader. Daily life in these northern lands was harsh. Winters were long and cold, limiting fresh food availability. Diets were rich in meat, fish, and fermented grains. Hygiene routines were shaped by available resources and social customs. But despite these challenges, the Vikings understood the importance of clean teeth not just for aesthetics, but to prevent pain and infection, which could hamper a warrior's ability. The problem of dental health. Archaeological studies of Viking skeletons reveal a telling story. Many Viking skulls show worn teeth from gritty foods. Cavities and abscesses are caused by sugar-rich fermented drinks and diets heavy in carbohydrates. Dental wear from using teeth as tools. Yet despite these challenges, some Vikings managed to maintain remarkably good oral hygiene for their time. So how? The ingredients of Viking toothpaste, historical texts, archaeological finds, and comparative studies point to a fascinating answer. Vikings used powdered animal hooves, charcoal, wood ash, and sometimes herbs to clean their teeth. Powdered. Hoof, ground from horse or reindeer hoof. The hard keratin was crushed into a fine powder. Its abrasive quality helped scrape away plaque and food debris. Ashes. Made by burning wood, ash contains mild alkaline compounds that neutralize acids in the mouth and act as a gentle cleanser. Charcoal, known for its absorptive properties, charcoal could absorb toxins and freshen breath. Herbs and resins, such as mint or juniper, are used for flavor and antiseptic qualities. These materials were mixed into a paste or used dry to rub teeth and gums. Tools of the trade. Without toothbrushes, Vikings used various implements. Chew. Sticks. Twigs from aromatic trees were chewed until frayed to make a natural brush. Cloth or leather strips wrapped around fingers to rub teeth clean. Bone or wood scrapers. Small tools fashioned to scrape plaque. Dental care was a routine part of life, not just for appearance, but for survival. Evening rituals on the longship picture a Viking crew, gathered below deck after a day of rowing or trading. They pull out small pouches containing their tooth cleaning powders. With a bit of water or saliva, they rub their teeth and gums, scraping away the remnants of a hearty meal. This quiet act, performed in the flickering light of an oil lamp, is a small but essential part of their lives.
Ow.
And as you listen, you might wonder, how did such simple materials provide care that in some ways rivaled modern toothpastes? In the cold dawn, light of a Viking village, before the day's raids or trades, warriors and farmers alike would engage in a quiet, careful routine. Their teeth, worn from a diet of coarse bread, dried fish, and fermented ale, needed tending. Materials they used were humble ash hoof powder and charcoal, but together, these formed a surprisingly effective dental care system. This section explores the scientific reasoning behind Viking tooth cleaning methods and the social rituals that accompanied them. Abrasives. How hoof powder worked. Horse and reindeer hooves are made of keratin, tough fibrous protein also found in human nails and hair. When ground into powder, keratin becomes an abrasive material that could scrape away food particles and plaque from teeth surfaces. Polish the enamel, reducing roughness that traps bacteria. Provide a mild scrubbing action without causing excessive damage. This natural abrasive was ideal for a time without synthetic chemicals. Alkalinity. Ashes and charcoal wood. Ash contains alkaline substances, such as potassium carbonate, which help neutralize acids produced by oral bacteria. This neutralization prevents tooth enamel erosion caused by acidic foods and drinks. Creates a less hospitable environment for cavity-causing bacteria. Freshens breath by absorbing unpleasant odors. Charcoal adds to this effect with its adsorptive properties, binding toxins and bacteria and removing them from the mouth. Herbal additives and their role. The Vikings' use of aromatic herbs, juniper, mint, and even resins was not only for flavor but also for their antimicrobial properties, reducing harmful bacteria. Soothing effects on inflamed gums. Ecological benefit, providing a fresh feeling much like modern mouthwash. These natural additives enhance the efficacy of their dental pastes. Rituals of cleanliness and community dental hygiene was not a solitary act. It often took place in social settings and villages. Families gathered to clean their teeth together, sharing tools and powders along ships. Crews maintained hygiene rituals to prevent illness on long voyages. Storytelling and instruction were woven into these moments, passing knowledge and culture. This communal aspect reinforced hygiene as a shared responsibility. The lasting impression, though, Viking dental methods may seem rudimentary. They reveal a sophisticated understanding of oral health based on observation, experience, and natural chemistry. They balanced available resources with health needs, creating a system that allowed many to retain their teeth well into old age. And so, as you drift into sleep, imagine the gentle scraping of hoof powder, the mild sting of ash, and the fresh scent of juniper, small but vital tradition that helped keep the Vikings ready for whatever the next day brought. What other ancient practices, simple yet effective, might still hold wisdom for us today? The teeth of the Vikings, weathered and worn, tell a story of resilience and resourcefulness. Their methods may seem strange to us, now using powdered hooves and ashes. But these ancient practices reveal a quiet ingenuity that echoes into our modern world. In this final section, we trace how these simple dental care habits faded with time, how archaeology uncovered their secrets, and what lessons they leave behind. Archaeological insights. Skeletal remains from Viking burial sites offer valuable clues. Researchers studying teeth find where patterns consistent with abrasive powders. Chemical analysis sometimes reveals traces of ash or charcoal residues. These findings confirm that, despite lacking modern toothpaste, Vikings took care of their teeth with the resources at hand. From Viking powder to modern toothpaste, the evolution from natural abrasives to today's sophisticated toothpaste was gradual. For centuries, cultures worldwide used powders and pastes made from charcoal, ground bones or shells, plant ashes, herbal extracts. Only in the 19th century did toothpaste begin to include fluoride and synthetic chemicals. The Viking method fits into this long tradition of natural dental care, reminding us that many modern products have roots in ancient ingenuity. Lessons for today. The Vikings' approach highlights using natural, available materials effectively. The importance of routine and ritual in health, combining science and tradition in practical ways. As you close your eyes, you might consider the value of slowing down, of simple acts performed regularly, quietly preserving health and readiness for whatever comes next. Closing reflection. Imagine a Viking warrior, aged and wise, his teeth clean and strong from years of careful care. With hoof and ash, his smile is not just survival, it is a testament to resilience, patience, and the human capacity to adapt. And so we ask, What small, persistent habits in your life hold power beyond their seeming simplicity? What ancient wisdom lies, waiting to be rediscovered, quietly shaping our health and history? In the dim light of a medieval monastery, tucked away from the clamor of the outside world, monks labored over fragile parchment, creating manuscripts that would preserve knowledge for centuries. But before a single letter could be penned, a crucial, often overlooked process took place: the making of ink. Ink was not a simple commodity. It was a sacred craft, a complex alchemy of natural ingredients painstakingly prepared. The quality of the ink determined the clarity, durability, and beauty of the manuscript, and a bad batch could mean hours of wasted work. This story begins in the cloisters, exploring the slow, meticulous, and sometimes maddening art of medieval ink making, and the monks' tireless pursuit of perfection. The scriptorium, a world of silence and light, the scriptorium was the heart of a monastery's intellectual life. Here monks copied sacred texts, classical works, and scientific treatises by hand, but the success of their work depended heavily on ink, a medium that was expected to last centuries without fading, smudging, or corroding the delicate parchment. The preparation of ink was a daily ritual, one that required patience, precision, and endurance. Ingredients of ink: from galls to gum arabic, the most common medieval ink was iron gall ink, made from oak galls, abnormal growths on oak trees caused by gall wasps, rich in tannic acid, iron salts, typically extracted from iron sulfate or rust. Gum arabic, a sticky sap from acacia trees, acting as a binder. Water, the solvent, carefully purified. The monks gathered or traded for these ingredients, then combined them in a slow chemical process that required constant stirring and monitoring. The complex chemistry of ink-making ink was a delicate balance of acid and iron, where too much of one ingredient could spoil the entire batch. Monks learned to crush oak galls into a fine powder, soak the powder in water to extract tannins, add iron sulfate to produce a dark pigment, mix in gum arabic to give the ink the right consistency and adhesion. The resulting ink was deep black when freshly applied, but would darken over time as it oxidized. Mistakes like adding too much iron could produce ink that corroded parchment or faded quickly. The trials and tribulations of ink making, the process was not without frustrations. Monks sometimes spent days stirring vats of ink, testing samples on scraps of parchment. Failures meant wasted ingredients and delayed work. Yet the monks persevered, treating ink making as both a science and a spiritual discipline. It was a craft that demanded not only skill, but also patience and, at times, considerable tolerance for maddening uncertainty. The quiet pursuit of perfection as candlelight flickered and the monastery grew silent at night. A lone monk might remain, carefully tending a vat of ink, testing its shade and viscosity. He knew that his work would outlive him, that the texts he helped illuminate would guide readers centuries in the future. And so the ritual continued, silent, slow, and sacred. And as you listen, you might wonder, what other unseen labors have shaped the legacy of knowledge through quiet devotion and tireless craft? The quiet hours of the scriptorium have passed. The ink pots have been sealed, quills cleaned, parchment stacked neatly for tomorrow's labor. But what remains? What always remains is the writing. This final section explores how the ink once dried on calfskin centuries ago endured time. It also uncovers the darker side of iron gall ink, and how modern scientists now study the very same ingredients that once stained the fingers of monks. In these fragile letters is a legacy not only of knowledge but also of chemistry, devotion, and quiet endurance. The problem with iron gall ink, though it was celebrated for its bold black color and permanence, iron gall ink came with a dangerous flaw. It could quite literally eat through the page. Over time, if not made with exact proportions, the iron in the ink would react with moisture, creating sulfuric acid, oxidize, producing a rusty residue, slowly corrode the parchment or paper on which it was written. Many ancient manuscripts now show ink burn, entire words flaking away as the ink is eaten through the page like acid on cloth. And yet, despite this, thousands of manuscripts still survive. Why? Because in monasteries where ink making was treated with care, the proportions were better balanced. These monks without modern chemistry intuited stability through repeated testing, keen observation, and collective memory. The modern science of medieval ink today, scientists and conservators examine medieval ink using spectroscopy to identify chemical composition, microscopy to view corrosion at the fiber level, digital imaging to recover damaged or faded text. Some teams have even recreated ancient ink following surviving recipes, comparing how different gall sources, gum arabic types, or iron concentrations affected results. These efforts help preserve existing manuscripts and guide restoration projects in libraries and archives around the world. In a strange twist, the monks' ink made in humble cloisters now inspires 21st century laboratories. Manuscripts that changed the world thanks to their careful ink making. Monks preserved the Bible, countless versions and translations, works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, medieval histories, calendars, and maps, philosophical texts, mathematical treatises, and even early medical handbooks. Had their ink faded, smeared, or eaten through the parchment entirely, vast portions of classical and medieval knowledge might have been lost. In short, good ink mattered. It held the world's memory. The chain of preservation, think of it, a monk in the 9th century prepares his ink from oak galls gathered at sunrise. He writes carefully by candlelight, each letter formed in reverence. His manuscript survives in a monastery, then a library, then a museum. Centuries later, a scholar reads his words printed in a modern edition. The chain stretches across 1,000 years, and it begins with ink. Closing reflection: in a world full of noise and haste, there is something almost radical about a man spending hours stirring ink, about copying a text, line by line, without ambition, without applause only. The quiet conviction that what is written must endure. So the next time you write a note, a journal entry, or even a grocery list, imagine the monk with his oak galls and gum arabic, and ask, what are you writing today that might still be read long after you're gone? In the heart of Constantinople, under golden mosaics and marble colonnades, the great machinery of the Byzantine Empire rumbled, not with swords and shields, but with ledgers, scrolls, and wax tablets. Long after the fall of Rome in the West, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, carried on with an astonishingly detailed and effective system of tax collection. In fact, its bureaucracy was so methodical that it could assess, count, and collect taxes and coin, goods, and livestock without computers, calculators, or even Arabic numerals. This is the story of how a world before spreadsheets and filing cabinets managed to tax a sprawling empire without losing track of a single sheep-whore. Nearly so. It's the inheritance of Rome. The Byzantine system didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built on the bones of the Roman bureaucracy, refined and adapted over centuries. The Romans had perfected the idea of census, land surveys, and tax in kind. The Byzantines expanded it into a full-fledged empire-wide operation that tracked agricultural production, livestock numbers, property boundaries, military obligations. Monastic and church exemptions, and all of this was done manually using tools of wood, wax, leather, and memory. The land tax. Cornerstone of Byzantine revenue, at the core of Byzantine taxation, was the land tax, or epibole. Every parcel of land, no matter how small, was measured and assessed. Local officials, known as proctors, would visit villages annually, measure fields using rope or marked sticks, estimate crop yields, count livestock, including sheep, goats, oxen, and chickens. Record ownership changes due to inheritance or sale. The data would then be transferred to wax tablets, copied onto parchment rolls, and forwarded up the chain of administration. Counting. Sheep. Literally, the Byzantines didn't trust abstractions. If your tax bill included livestock, the number mattered. A shepherd could be taxed in sheep, and inspectors might physically count the flock. Brand or mark animals already taxed. Record ages, breeds, and even wool production estimates. In border provinces, tax collectors sometimes traveled with guards to ensure compliance. In more settled areas, Village elders vouched for the accuracy of tax rolls. Missing a sheep wasn't just carelessness. It meant revenue loss and possibly suspicion of fraud. Memory and manuscript. How did they keep all this straight? Byzantine administrators relied on wax tablets for temporary calculations, codices and scrolls for long-term records. Professional scribes trained to write quickly and legibly, a tradition of oral reporting, where local knowledge supplemented records. Some tax agents memorized entire village rosters, land plots, and family lineages. Mistakes could mean exile or punishment, so precision was a matter of survival. Taxes and the army. One of the primary reasons the Byzantine state cared so much about accurate taxes was to pay and provision the military. Taxes in kind, grain, meat, cloth, and animals were often directed to army units stationed in distant regions. There are records of sheep collected in Anatolia being sent to the Balkans, wine levies from the Aegean Islands shipped to garrisons. In Armenia, grain stored in massive imperial granaries, carefully inventoried. It was a massive logistical operation, built atop small village visits and humble field measurements. The quiet accountants of empire. Picture a lone proctor, sitting by candlelight in a village guest house, cross-referencing a sheepskin scroll with this year's flock totals. Outside, shepherds murmur anxiously, "A storm is coming." Ah! But he must finish his calculations before moving on. Each tally mark, each scratched number, helps hold together a sprawling empire of emperors, generals, and peasants. And as you settle into sleep, you might ask, how many forgotten lives were once measured, counted, and quietly recorded only so that others could forget them? The image of Byzantine bureaucracy often conjures dense scrolls, silent scribes, and tax officials trudging across wind-swept fields with wax tablets and ledgers. But beneath this orderly surface was a world of improvisation, patronage, and the occasional bribe, because even in a system designed to count sheep without missing one, humans were still very much involved. This section explores the human side of the Byzantine tax machine, its ingenuity, its imperfections, and how it quietly adapted over centuries without collapsing. Taxes as negotiation, not just obligation. The Byzantine state depended on taxes, but enforcement was not always absolute. In rural regions, especially in mountainous or border areas, tax officials often found themselves negotiating missing animals, conveniently herded into the woods. Crops said to have failed, though granaries seemed full land, boundaries suddenly under dispute rather than conflict. The system preferred compromise. Proctors and local landowners would sometimes agree on a reduced tax rate, recorded with careful euphemisms, such as adjusted due to hardship or partial harvest levy. This made the system more flexible and likely helped it survive longer than many of its contemporaries. Monasteries and the art of exemption. As the Byzantine Empire grew more Christianized, monasteries became significant landholders and powerful political entities. Many monasteries negotiated tax exemptions with the state for religious services rendered. In exchange for hosting travelers or storing food for the army, or simply due to imperial favor, these exemptions were meticulously recorded. But they often required renewal with each new emperor. Some clever monks even employed scribes of their own to manage this paperwork, so that sheep counted in the name of the monastery would never make their way into the imperial books. The bureaucrat as career. The Byzantine administrative system supported generations of bureaucrats' families who handed down the skills of writing, accounting, and law. Boys were trained from a young age in basic arithmetic, often using abacuses or counting stones, letter formation, and scroll preparation, legal terminology. Provincial dialects to communicate with farmers and landowners. A skilled proctor might serve for decades, rising through the ranks to become a logothetes, a high-ranking treasury official in Constantinople. The best ones were known not for cruelty, but for clarity, consistency, and discretion. Bribes, mistakes, and margins of error. Despite the ideal of precision, corruption and error crept in. Some tax collectors padded their reports, collecting extra levies for themselves. Others were bribed to underreport a wealthy landowners. Assets. But the Byzantine state had ways to cope, rotating officials so no one stayed in one region too long, double-checking ledgers against army supply demands. Secret audits dispatched by the central government. These efforts weren't perfect, but they helped contain abuse enough to keep the system functional for centuries. Storage, transit, and the physical burden of bureaucracy unlike today's digital taxes. Byzantine tax records were heavy, fragile, and flammable. Documents were stored in monastic archives, imperial chanceries, local administrative buildings. Called secreta, transporting tax data from provinces to the capital could take weeks or months, especially during winter or wartime. Records were copied multiple times, one for the village, one for the province, and one for Constantinople. Mistakes in copying were common, and yet, somehow, the tax system remained remarkably intact. A bureaucracy at bedtime. Picture the quiet corner of a monastery archive. A tired scribe rubs his eyes, then dips his stylus in ink again. The column he's transcribing contains the annual sheep levy from the hills of Bithynia. He's recorded the same number 3 times now, but pauses, uncertain. Was it 247 or 274? He checks the wax tablet, smiles faintly. 247 it is. One more. Number that will help fund an empire. And as you close your eyes, consider this. What systems today, vast and complicated, still rely on small moments of quiet care? In the candlelit corners of provincial archives and the echoing halls of Constantinople's palaces, the Byzantine tax system lived and breathed. But like all things imperial, it was not eternal. This final section explores how the Byzantine tax machine evolved in its later centuries, how its fragments outlived the empire itself, and how surprisingly it helped shape future systems of administration across Europe and the Middle East, the shrinking of the empire and its bureaucracy. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the Byzantine Empire had begun to shrink under external pressure and internal fractures. The Seljuk Turks pushed into Anatolia. The Crusades reshaped borders and alliances. The empire's economy became more unstable, especially after the sack of Constantinople in 1204 by Latin crusaders. Still, the bureaucracy endured. Even in chaos, tax records were kept. Even in exile, emperors attempted to assess grain fields, sheep flocks, and taxable estates. Some tax officials fled with ledgers in hand. In successor states like the Empire of Nicaea or the Despotate of Epirus, these documents were used to reconstruct local administration. The tax system adapted, fractured, but did not disappear. Byzantine influence on Islamic and Western tax systems. One of the least celebrated legacies of Byzantium is its bureaucratic influence. When Islamic empires expanded into former Byzantine territories, they encountered a well-oiled machine for surveying land, assessing crop yields, organizing census data, collecting taxes in coin and kind. Rather than destroy this system, many adopted or adapted it. The Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, for instance, integrated aspects of Byzantine and Sasanian administrative models into their own. Later, in Europe, the Holy Roman Empire and even parts of Renaissance Italy revived Roman Byzantine techniques of record-keeping and land taxation. So when medieval kings sent officials to count pigs and sheep in the countryside, they were, whether they knew it or not, channeling Constantinople. Rediscovered records, modern fascination in modern times. Scholars have uncovered Byzantine tax records buried in monastery libraries and private collections. These record some scorched, some water-damaged, some perfectly intact, offer unique view into daily life across the empire. They reveal the precise amounts of garlic owed by a village to a garrison, changes in crop output after droughts, shifts in population and wealth after invasions. Each number, each scratched name, is a thread in a much larger web. Researchers now use digital databases to reconstruct provincial economies and logistical systems from 1,000 years ago. The tax work of forgotten monks and bureaucrats is in a way being revived. The sheep that carried an empire, it may seem mundane counting. Sheep weighing sacks of barley, recording the sale of a cow butt for the Byzantines. This was not bureaucracy for its own sake. It was the glue that held together armies marching to distant borders, monasteries illuminating holy texts, ports buzzing with trade cities fed by distant farms. Without these records, without these careful counts, the entire imperial machine might have stalled. In that sense, the humble sheep, tallied and taxed, carried the empire not just in body, but in recorded memory. Closing reflection, and so as you rest your head, imagine a bureaucrat from 1,000 years ago sitting with a ledger on his knees, a candle sputtering beside him, checking his sums with a furrowed brow. He didn't fight wars, he didn't write scripture, but he kept the empire running, one sheep, one scroll, and one tally at a time. And we ask, what small, unnoticed tasks in your life are quietly keeping your own world together? Long before airplanes, email, or even the Pony Express. A letter sent during China's Han Dynasty 26 BCE, 2220 CE, could travel astonishing distances at an impressive speed. From the imperial court in Chang'an to the frontier forts of the Gansu corridor, urgent messages flew across thousands of miles on horseback thanks to a vast, meticulously managed relay system. This is the story of how a civilization 2,000 years ago connected its vast territory using roads, horses, and the quiet efficiency of dedicated state couriers whose speed and endurance often rivaled modern expectations. The Han Empire. Vast and demanding at its height. The Han Dynasty stretched from the Pacific coast to the edges of Central Asia. It included mountains and rivers, deserts and forests, dense cities, and remote garrisons. Administering such a large and diverse territory required more than military strength. It required fast, reliable communication. And so the Han emperors built one of the world's first state postal systems, known as the Yichuan, the imperial relay. How the relay system worked, the Han postal relay functioned on a simple but powerful principle: fresh horses at fixed intervals. Roads were built or maintained along major routes. Relay stations, called Yi, were placed every 10 to 30 li, approximately 3 to 10 miles. Each station housed fresh horses, food, and messengers ready for handoff. A courier would ride at full speed to the next station, hand the message to the waiting rider, and the message continued, sometimes around the clock. Messages from the capital to the frontiers could travel hundreds of miles in a single day under ideal conditions. Official versus private communication, not just anyone could use the imperial courier system. It was strictly for official business. Orders from the emperor, tax records and census data, military reports, diplomatic letters. Each message carried a seal or token indicating its urgency and priority. There were even graded levels of speed. Urgent orders might be flagged with red ink or a feather symbol, demanding non-stop relay. Routine reports moved more slowly, sometimes pausing at stations overnight. Top-secret communiques were carried by trusted emissaries who could not be replaced along the way. Private citizens used slower methods: merchants, travelers, or family couriers. Roads and routes. The Han invested heavily in infrastructure. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was also a postal highway. The northern and southern routes linked China to Central Asia, enabling international communication. In the east, post roads branched into Korea and along the coast. Roads were paved where possible, but more often they were packed earth, widened for cart traffic and maintained by local officials. Bridges were built, ferries were organized, mountains were tunneled through. The relay system became the nervous system of empire. The couriers themselves, these weren't just random riders. Couriers were state-trained, skilled in horseback riding, often from childhood required to be literate, to read and memorize messages in case of theft or damage, trained to handle extreme conditions, heat, snow, bandits, wild terrain. They wore distinctive uniforms and carried official tokens or banners indicating their role. Locals were required to assist them, offering meals, water, or directions. The job was difficult, lonely, and dangerous, but also honorable. In many parts of China, these couriers became folk heroes, their speed and reliability celebrated in poems and stories. A Message in the Night. Now imagine a quiet station at the edge of the desert. The wind kicks up dust. Lone rider approaches, tired but fast. He dismounts without a word, hands the scroll to the waiting courier, and drinks from a ladle of warm tea. Within minutes, the new rider is galloping off. The message and order from the emperor still warm from its original seal, flying into the night toward a distant general. And you might wonder, how did these early couriers, without maps or machines, keep an empire bound by paper and speed? With horses galloping across vast plains and messages passing hand to hand at way stations, the Han courier system wasn't just a feat of logistics, it was also a triumph of protocol, materials, and administrative design. In this section, we move from the gallop to the scroll, from the dusty roads to the inner halls of government, and from physical movement to mental infrastructure. We explore how messages were composed, how paper changed everything, and how the Han court developed the discipline needed to manage an empire on the move. From silk to paper, the evolution of the message. Early Han documents were typically written on bamboo slips or wooden tablets. Bundled with string numbered in sequence, heavy and bulky messages written on these materials required extra effort to carry more weight. It's more space and more potential for loss or breakage. But then, in the early 2nd century BCE, something quietly revolutionary happened. Paper was developed in China. Traditionally attributed to T.S. Lin, in 105 CE, paper was lightweight, foldable, easier to write on, easier to store and transport. It spread first among government officials. Suddenly, couriers weren't lugging bamboo bundles. They were carrying folded paper, sealed with wax, pressed into sleeves, and marked for priority. This change dramatically improved the efficiency of long-distance communication. Seals, tokens, and the language of authority. Not every scroll was created equal. Han communications were stratified and structured. The emperor's messengers carried official seals indicating their mission. Bronze tokens, marked with imperial insignia, paper slips with ink stamps for lesser officials, color-coded ribbons, feathers, or wax markers, indicating urgency. Couriers were instructed to yield the road to messages marked more urgent than theirs. Even a slow-moving tax report could be overridden by a red-tagged military dispatch. Failure to yield or failure to secure a message could lead to dismissal, fines, or, in rare cases, corporal punishment. This attention to hierarchy in communication mirrored the broader structure of Han society. Order, respect, and record-keeping were sacred values. The bureaucracy behind the ride. For every courier galloping toward the frontier, there was an army of clerks, scribes, and supervisors. Behind him, messages were logged upon dispatch, with time, place, sender, and purpose. Duplicated for the local archive, reviewed upon arrival, sometimes copied again into central record books. High-ranking officials, like the Grand Administrator, Taisho, oversaw regional post operations, ensuring that roads were maintained, horses were healthy, and stations were stocked with supplies. Local mayors and village heads were held accountable for supporting the system, and failure to do so could result in loss of position or imperial reprimand. The relay was not simply a service. It was an extension of imperial will radiating outward, like veins from the beating heart of the court in Chang'an. Obstacles on the road, and yet the empire was not a flat plain. Couriers faced snow-choked mountain passes in the west, flooded river valleys in the south, bandits operating in lawless pockets, periodic wars, rebellions, and famines disrupting entire relay chains. In some cases, horses died en route, riders were injured or killed, messages were lost and had to be resent by alternate paths. The state prepared for this. Redundancy was built in. Backup riders were stationed at key junctures. Couriers were trained in evasion and endurance. This was not a casual system. It was imperial infrastructure at its most determined. Horses. The unsung heroes. The entire system depended on the horses themselves. The Han maintained stables in key locations, with different breeds selected for terrain: stocky mountain ponies and Sichuan lean, long-legged breeds in the northern plains. Desert-adapted types for the Western Silk Road. Horses were rotated and rested at stations, fed a specific diet, sometimes with grain and salt supplements. Monitored by stable masters who reported to provincial officials, records survived detailing the rationing of barley, the rotation schedules of horses, and even injury logs for equine workers. The animals were not treated as disposable. They were essential state assets, the empire in motion, and now, picture the world as it once was. A folded message rests beneath the flap of a courier's jacket, warm from his chest. It holds an edict that will change the position of a governor or a warning of invaders along the northern frontier. His horse's hooves drum a steady rhythm on the packed road lined by millet fields and stone boundary markers. He does not stop. He does not sleep. In a relay station farther ahead, another horse is already saddled. Another rider is already waiting. And as you drift towards sleep, you might ask, how much of the world has been built not by those who ruled or rode, but by those who rode through the night to deliver the words? The Han courier system galloped at the heart of an empire swift, silent, and often invisible. But like all imperial constructs, it was vulnerable not just to enemies on horseback or shifting sands in the west, but to the slow unraveling of the state that built it. In this final section, we follow the decline of the imperial postal system and how its structures outlived the dynasty, influenced later empires, and quietly helped knit together one of the largest continuous civilizations in history. Appear by the 2nd century CE, the Han dynasty was fraying. Corruption weakened the central government. Eunuch factions and court intrigues undermined imperial authority. Peasant rebellions like the Yellow Turban, the uprising destabilized entire provinces. External pressures mounted along the northern and western borders. Relay stations began to fall into disrepair. Roads went unpatrolled. Messages were delayed, misdirected, or simply never arrived. The infrastructure that had once moved an empire began to fail in fragments. Relay stations reclaimed by the earth, some of the earliest signs of collapse were visible in the countryside. In the northwestern regions, archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of abandoned courier stations, stone walls crumbling into desert sand-charred beams. Perhaps from bandit raids, or simple neglect, discarded stirrups, shattered ink pots, and rusted bits of horse tack, these stations, once humming with activity, had become ghostly, a silent ledger of imperial absence. In some places, villagers repurposed old stations into farmhouses or storehouses, transforming once critical nodes into quiet local ruins. The knowledge that survived, and yet even as the system faltered, its ideas endured. When the Han collapsed and the Three Kingdoms era began, successor states like Wei, Shu, and Wu sought to rebuild versions of the relay. They understood the value of speed, message integrity, and bureaucratic communication. The Yichuan system may have faltered, but it left behind manuals, roadmaps, personnel records, drafts of relay reforms. This administrative memory became part of the institutional DNA of future Chinese dynasties. Tang and Song, a system reborn centuries later during the Tang 618 to 907 and Song 9-601-279 dynasties. The idea of a central courier system was revived and improved. Roads were widened and stone paved. Courier stations were standardized and state-funded. Innovations like postal tokens, timing logs, and paper seals were introduced. Tenera couriers could rival or even outpace their Han predecessors. In this way, the Han legacy lived on not as nostalgia, but as reliable infrastructure, reinvigorated by new emperors and engineers. Global echoes: the Han relay system had no direct contact with the Roman cursus publicus. Yet the parallels are striking. Fixed stations, fresh horses, hierarchical message speeds, state funding, and oversight in the centuries that followed. From the Mongol Ilkhanate to the Ottoman Empire built similar networks. Even European monarchies later developed royal posts inspired in part by earlier Eastern models. Without fanfare, the relay system became one of the most influential logistical ideas in human history. What archaeology tells us today? Much of what we know comes from excavated relay station sites. Administrative scrolls found in dry caves and tombs, stamped messages preserved on bamboo or silk, official records discovered in Han Dynasty tombs. Carefully bundled and sealed, one such message found near Dunhuang still bore its courier's fingerprint. Pressed faintly into wax 2,000 years ago. That fingerprint, as fragile as a dried leaf, links us directly to a man who once rode beneath. The stars, message tight in hand, racing toward the edge of empire. Final reflection. The speed of empire as your eyes begin to close. Imagine a courier pulling his robe tighter against the cold. The stars are out. His horse's breath clouds in the air. He has one more station before dawn. Ahead of him lies a scroll, delicate, official, urgent. Behind him, 1,000 miles of roads, stations, and invisible threads that connect emperor to general and province to court. And you might ask yourself, what message is delivered quietly, dependably, without? Glory have held your own life together. In a windswept valley on a cold North Atlantic island, nestled between jagged lava fields and glacier-fed rivers, a group of farmers, chieftains, and law speakers gathered each summer not to fight, but to talk. This was not a battle. It was the Althing, the oldest surviving national parliament in the world, founded around 930 CE in medieval Iceland. Here, amid the moss and stone, with no monarch to command them and no palace to shelter them, Icelanders created a system of law and order, where decisions were made by speaking aloud, disputes were settled in public, and attendance was recorded, not with parchment or seal, but by standing in the right place at the right time. This is the story of how a scattered society of Viking settlers built a functioning parliament without buildings, without centralized power, and without ever losing track of who showed up. A new island, a new society by the late 9th century. Norse settlers from Norway and other parts of Scandinavia began to arrive in Iceland. Many were escaping the growing power of Norwegian kings' feuds and family conflicts. A desire for land ownership and autonomy. Iceland had no indigenous population and was seen as a blank slate, an untamed land where a new kind of society could take root. But with hundreds of families now scattered across a harsh volcanic landscape, the settlers needed something more than just isolated farmsteads. They needed law, structure, and a way to resolve disputes before they turned violent. Thus was born the Althing. Thingvellir, the field of assembly. The Althing met each summer at Thingvellir. It's a field of assembly, a broad plain flanked by cliffs and divided by a great fissure in the earth, created by the mid-Atlantic ridge. Why here? It was roughly centrally located for most settlers. The terrain was flat enough for tents, horses, and markets. The Lagberg, or Law Rock, was a natural platform where speeches could carry over the crowd. The landscape itself became part of the governance, stone and air, replacing throne and marble. This was a parliament in the open air. The structure of the Althing, unlike European kingdoms, Iceland had no king, no central army, and no palaces. Instead, authority was distributed among local chieftains, called Gogr, singular, Gogi. Each Gogi represented a district called a Gogorg, was responsible for maintaining order and leading their followers, attended the Althing on behalf of their region, had the right to participate in legislative and judicial functions. Each free man had the right to choose which chieftain to follow, meaning Gogar needed to be respected and fair or risk losing support. Attendance at the Althing was expected for Gogar and their retinues. Not attending could result in fines or worse, the loss of influence. The law speaker and the spoken. Law, in place of a written legal code, Icelanders relied on a law speaker, LGS cum Mor, elected for a 3-year term. His duties? Memorize and recite 1/3 of the laws each summer. Preside over meetings at the Law Rock, act as a neutral advisor in disputes. Maintain oral continuity of Iceland's legal tradition. The law speaker did not write, spoke. His words were binding, and the spoken word, repeated, heard, and witness served as both record and authority. Even attendance was managed aloud. Names were called, confirmed, and recorded in memory, or carved on sticks and tablets by scribes or assistants. There was no central ledger, but everyone knew who had stood where. Parliament in tents each. Summer, the Althing resembled a massive camping tripor, perhaps a medieval fair. Delegates arrived from across the island, traveling for days on horseback. Tents called booths or boyer were set up in semi-permanent locations. Families camped together, children played, traders set up shop. While laws were debated, Icelanders bought and sold goods, arranged marriages, resolved property disputes, caught up on news from distant fjords. Attendance wasn't just about civic duty, it was also the social event of the year. The Althing blended law, economy, and community into one open-air institution. It's a silent roll call. And so we return to the field. A chieftain steps forward, his boots crunching on volcanic gravel. He nods to the law speaker. His name is spoken, echoed, and remembered. He takes his place among the circle of Gogr. Behind him, his followers murmur, adjusting their cloaks against the wind. No one checks a list. No one stamps a document. But they are counted. The field knows. The law rock bears witness. And in the silence between proclamations, a society holds itself together not by force, but by presence. And you might wonder, in a world without pens, paper, or power, what does it mean to simply show up? By the time you had crossed lava plains, river crossings, and mountain passes to arrive at Thingvellir, you had entered a space unlike anywhere else in medieval Europe. You were not in a king's court, nor in a bishop's, but on neutral ground, where words carried the weight of swords, and presence was as powerful as parchment. In this section, we step deeper into the living organism that was the Althing, not just a parliament, but a courthouse, a marketplace, a marriage hall, and a national bulletin board. Here, law was enacted and embodied, and attendance was not just political, it was personal. Law in a land without kings in most of medieval Europe, justice came downward from monarchs or churchmen. In Iceland, justice came sideways from the people through their chieftains, mediated by consensus and memory. The Althing was both a legislative body, where new laws could be proposed, and debated a judicial arena. Where disputes were resolved and judgments passed, there was no standing army to enforce verdicts. Instead, enforcement relied on community pressure, honor, and fines. Punishments were rarely physical. Instead, outlaws were declared banished from society. Fines were paid in silver, livestock, or goods. Mediation was common before escalation to trial. The emphasis was on restoring balance, not vengeance. The booths of law, and living by the 11th century, Thingvellir had grown into a temporary legal village. Families built semi-permanent stone-walled booths, roofed with turf and fabric. Gogr conducted their business from these booths. Legal assistant. Thingmen recorded events, settled fines, and kept track of cases. While the law speaker addressed the crowds from the Lagberg Law Rock, individual courts gathered around natural landmarks. The 5 courts, which handled appeals, spring assemblies for smaller disputes, arbitration panels for local feuds. These courts had no gavels, no raised benches, just men standing in circles or seated on rocks, debating under the open sky. And still, people kept track. They remembered who was present, who was absent, and who had the right to speak. Memory, as record keeper, the Icelanders had a deep cultural tradition of oral history sagas. Genealogies and law codes all passed down through repetition and performance. Because of this, the Althing operated not with ledgers, but with memory-trained minds. Names were recited aloud at the start of proceedings. Attendance was witnessed by the crowd and spoken into law. Disputes over attendance or presence were often settled by public testimony. If a chieftain failed to show up, or if a witness was absent, it was not hidden in a drawer, it was public knowledge. There was power in being seen, and shame in not being seen when duty called. The drama of trials court sessions at the Althing were sometimes quiet affairs, but others could draw hundreds of onlookers. Consider a typical legal case. A farmer accuses a neighbor of cutting timber on his land. Witnesses are called. Their words are spoken clearly. The law speaker may be asked to clarify relevant legal traditions. A panel of judges, often other chieftains or respected freemen, makes the ruling. The result is announced aloud to the assembly. No gavel, no parchment, only spoken word, memory, and community. And sometimes, These trials made their way into the Icelandic sagas, where the outcomes echoed down generations. Cycles of law each year, the process repeated. The Gogr and their thingmen gathered in the same places. The law speaker resumed his recitation, picking up where he left off. New laws were proposed, often in response to feuds or shifts in custom. Old laws were amended or discarded entirely if found unworkable. Attendance was not optional for the Gogr. Failure to appear could lead to fines imposed by the court's loss of legal standing in extreme cases. The transfer of a chieftain's position to a more competent leader, thus, the mere act of showing up, standing in one's appointed spot and responding to one's name, was itself an act of governance. A parliament beneath the sky, and so, night falls on Thingvellir. Torches flicker in stone booths. Horses graze nearby. A few final voices rise from a court still in session, perhaps a theft. The law rock stands quiet now, waiting for the morning. Nearby, a child asks their parent why they had to come so far just to listen to names being called. The parent replies, "Because this is how we know we still belong to each other." And you might wonder, in a world where so much is hidden? Behind screens and walls, what might we gain by standing in a circle and being counted together?